Since our topic for this year is strategies for an urban society, Peter is going to talk to us for a short period this lunchtime on his thoughts about what is a city for. Will you join me in welcoming Peter Carrico?
Well, I thank you for that very generous introduction. I have to say this is one of the parts of the planet that I regard as sane, creative. You may not think so, but for yourselves. But this is really a wonderful place to come. And as John was talking about sort of horizontal and deep, I was looking at my first image, thinking, right, got that one right. Right, we're supposed to be over by when?
Well, we're all out of here at 2:30. You have 45 minutes, but they might want to ask you a question at the end. So
right.
35.
This is going to be, we may find ourselves watching slides go by. To a certain extent, what I'm about to say is kind of preaching to the converted. I mean, just judging from, what I've seen and what's gone on here for 20 years, however long it's been. I started putting it together in this fashion in the context of Cambridge, where there's an awful lot of study on what they call environmental studies, and usually by that they mean what you can measure and sort of efficiency and this weird problem of comfort that seems to sit somewhere between a bunch of standards and a symbol. And realizing that things like energy were for the, all the discussion about minimizing energy was leaving out kind of what it was for. And the crude approximation was that it was for the sake of the culture. That one's urban culture was what one was trying to fight for, what was on the table. And at the same time, even amongst the converted, there are still sort of techniques by which we make the city too easy to just kind of bring into the studio and play with on our own. And we don't have to go back out. We don't have to be part of the city. We show up with these kind of with form or something like that, and try to say it's good for the city. Everybody wants the city to be good. But it turns out that there's actually very little literature on the question, what is the city for? And even if you go into very ancient texts, you can see that it kind of vacillates between Sodom and Gomorrah and heavenly Jerusalem, depending on the context and so forth. But again, for the sake of speed, the person who really put this question on the table was Aristotle in both the Nicomachean Ethics and the Politics, which are of course connected to each other. And I'm not going to go through the specific quotes and so forth. I'm going to give you some quotes, but we don't have time to get lost in Aristotle, as interesting as that is. He first of all says what it isn't. It's not simply for the prevention of crime and the distribution of goods, which of course are two of the really key themes of the way city planners tend to think of cities. And so that's a good reminder. He declares that the purpose of the polis is, quote, the good life, separately for an individual and collectively for the polis. The life conjoined with virtue, arete, which isn't the same as values, and I'm not going to have time to come back to that, furnished with sufficient means for taking part in virtuous actions, means the basic, everything from what a house is like to where you get your water from. At the beginning of the Nicomachean, what you're looking at on the screen, for those of you who don't know it, is the city of Priene, which was laid out probably by Hippodamus of Miletus across the river mouth, who gets a favorable mention in the Politics. At the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle proposes a kind of hierarchy, moving from the life of pleasure through the political life to the life of contemplation, as it's often translated. The Greek term is bios theoretikos, where theory is not the kind of theory that you know from the 17th century, theory, practice, and architectural theory, but contemplation of that which is common to all, therefore most likely divine. A good polis is one that is well situated between the mountain and the shoreline, well nourished and supplied with fresh water, well defended and suitably organized and governed to provide for the virtuous life and ultimately for the theos theoretikos. So in terms of a purpose of the city, sorry, you're going to get a couple of diagrams. You're dealing with a kind of stratification rooted in praxis that moves between the fundamental conditions and one's insight or understanding of those. It's probably the simplest way I can put it. We would probably call it customs culture. It would be lovely to go into logos and nomos, but again, we don't have time for that. If we want to slightly more differentiate that, I want to call attention to this phenomenon of praxis, because it'll come, it's a motif that will come back to us. What you're basically saying here is that praxis is the means by which, and to define praxis, I suppose it's a subcategory of what the phenomenologists call situation. It's involvement with people and things. And that involvement always involves a distance, which is, you know, where the understanding comes from and how the involvement creates the basis for choice, for interpretation, for judgments. And I will come back to this at the end. Aristotle, and following him Gadamer, very strongly separates techne, which is basically what we know as the arts, know-how relating to making things. It's got an outcome. He separates that from phronesis, which are things like morals and politics, which are done for their own sake. This is precisely what, you know, a utopia like Ledoux's or Le Corbusier's doesn't do. It tries to make phronesis subject to techne. And at the very end, I'll come back, and I want to say something. I think that separation is crucial. But when we talk about physis as the fundamental conditions, it's somewhere between, you know, the whole, I'll mention later the whole problem of what we think nature is. But think of it for the moment as just fundamental conditions, remembering that the gods, which aren't simply God of, but are a whole, you know, structure of relationships that involve sacrifice, that involve obligations, that involve relationships, were originally deeply involved with physis. And the origins of philosophy, the movement from poetry to prose, all this sort of stuff, begins with the physikoi, with the attempts to understand nature as a kind of metaphor or symbol for the structure of reality. Okay, again, cutting a long story very short, this kind of city, which Kevin Lynch dismisses as agriculture, is just sort of a phase, lasts for well over 2,000 years. And this is one of its reincarnations in the Middle Ages. Again, I hope you know it, so we don't need a whole lot of discussion about what it is. And what, of course, you're looking at is the Sala dei Nove of in Siena, in the Palazzo Publico. It is, can I get the arrow to come up? Yes, it's right there in the Palazzo Publico, and you'll remember this reciprocity between the kind of political and ceremonial space devoted to the town and that setting devoted to the cathedral as a kind of primary dialectic in the town. And what's interesting about this room is that it's built around good and evil. That is to say, the Nove were kind of like the House of Lords. They were the preeminent political body that then informed the Grand Consiglio, and it'd be nice to go through the whole topography of this building, but we're not going to. And setting it up as a room divided between good and evil cities, as you know. And if we could just summarize that setting, why I'm interested in this is, first of all, that it's structured as an agon, as a conflict, in which all sides are always included. This is in fact the way the Greek polis was set up, by institutionalizing the places of conflict or potential conflict. So for example, in a law case, it didn't matter who won or lost. What was really important was that there was a structure which reconciled, the history, individual life of citizens with the fundamental conditions. And it was, in fact, a kind of temenos, where it took place in various places, but the Helaya was basically a temenos open to the sky. This replicates that and gives it another level of articulation through the frescoes. And as you may know, where's my arrow? By the way, you can hear me back there? Yeah, people have heard me through whole buildings. So, is that the city wall on both sides goes across the room at roughly the same place. And there are two little angels. That's the back of one. Sorry, this little CAD model is basically just a diagram. Talks about a city through which you can walk with freedom. And this reminds you of the kind of conditions in which this room existed. Siena was frankly quite dangerous. You needed a passport to get across it. And in the whole idea of making a peaceful place where all those famous activities that that you know from the Buon Governo are located, was a kind of ideal. It's not the sort of tourist museum that we know it. The way the room is also structured is that the outside, which is part of the city, the fields, they're part of the contrade, and again, we don't have time to go into all that, oh shit, are on the back part that go to a window where you can actually see across the Tuscan landscape. That, at the opposite end of the room, is that famous, it's almost a purely symbolic space. It's a judgment that goes with that's a judgment which goes with the judgment of the evil government. But it's set up as a Diaz with Siena dressed as Solomon doing his judgment with figures coming in from the right and virtues just displayed in this kind of blue heaven. And so you get this kind of structure that moves from a kind of actual Eden to this judgment that stands for the last judgment along the length of the room. And the room itself is a receptacle by which the particular debate about what a law is, what kind of decisions are made, are reconciled with more universal conditions of what is a town, what is common to all with respect to the town. And so that business of seeing situations, seeing taking that agonic situation and setting it within this deep horizon represents an understanding of town in its depth. Not every room has this latently. This room has it explicitly. It also raises the question of, how much danger does a city need, or how much conflict does a city need, and of what kind? It's like, how much sickness do you need for health? And it's a kind of question that people rarely ask. Everything is just assumed to be neat, clean, and you end up producing buildings that are formed wrapped, with insulation and sheetrock, and everybody's supposed to be happy. And the full dynamism of it, the business of being human, and what good city has not had an element of danger, has not had an element of the chthonic that's been part of its primary life. In terms of the actual topographies that this kind of town represented, you kind of know, you're kind of very familiar with them. I still maintain that they're not very well understood for reasons I'll come to in a moment. But if we, just chronologically, if we have Padova, which is same date, 14th century, this is the 14th century section of Padova, same sort of date as the fresco, you see these great big blocks that are about 250 meters, 300 meters on the long side, with almost a town within the block. And that capacity to have a world that has, kind of 5-year or 10-year cycles operating against something that may have cycles of centuries, wealthy and poor, garden and street that can breathe, you realize that something like street is made by these deep backgrounds. And these are just examples of that kind of block structure from the lower left, Paris in roughly the 17th and 18th century, next to that Prague in the 19th century, and then a late 19th, early 20th century faubourg of Paris, where you've got kind of a town within a block. And again, if we had more time, it would be fun to sort of look at that more closely. But that business of setting up towns within towns, of local areas that can be very different in quality from the public, goes along with the idea that what was appropriate to the agora or the forum, a kind of interior devoted to self-understanding, could be extended to the street. And you first see hints of that with the Lorenzetti. Okay, I'm going to develop two kinds of city, one of which I'm going to call ethos, and I'm going to build it around two conditions of freedom, which I'm borrowing from Nietzsche. He refers to the difference between freedom for, which assumes that you're free and asks to what it's committed, from freedom from, which is all about liberation, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And I'm using this image from Klenze as a kind of first hint of how old this problem of the paradigm of the medieval and Renaissance Republican city has been for European planning, for thinking what Europe is. We're still working with it. Whether we properly understand it, we tend to replicate it rather than rethink it. Okay, what I want to now go through is about 6 stages of flattening of the city. So what we've got is a city that's built out of agonic interiors that have, you know, different levels of decorum, different levels of symbolic orientation, so on and so forth. And from about 500 years, over about 500 years, we figured out ways of flattening it, i.e. making it more available to design, to cut a long story short. On the one side, there's a Renaissance phenomenon that's known as renovatio urbis, which is just Latin for urban renewal, but it means something completely different from what we mean by that, because it meant not simply, you know, repairing things or building, I don't know, housing, though it certainly, you know, included ports, fields, navigation, but it involved the whole city. So it involved charity, it involved festivals, commissioning of plays, commissioning of poems. So it had to do with the whole constantly renewing the spiritual purpose of the city. At the same time, it began to narrow the scope of what was involved. You can see that this reciprocity between civitas, which deals with the people, the kind of urban culture, and urbs, which deals with the physical fabric, is kind of like the reciprocity that we had between logos and nomos and physis, but it's narrower. It's all happening within the scope of the city, and you know, the role of nature is not ignored so much as it just doesn't, it's not part of the speculation of the meaning of being through city that it was originally. Even more fundamentally, it began to narrow the scope of what urbs meant, primarily through a series of techniques, one of which you know from the famous Vitruvian stage sets, these as rendered by Serlio, where the upper one is, of course, the tragic stage set, referring to the nobles, to the centers of the city, where there was deemed to be a concentration of beauty, meaning, land values, and below that is the periphery, which is the artisan's world, which Serlio renders as Gothic, therefore a species of kind of peripheral order, more messy. And in general, 2 things are happening here. One is transforming the meaning into the visual domain and giving a very high priority. I mean, the whole apparatus of plan, section, perspective that is, you know, this standard 4 screens you get in a CAD package was invented at this time, basically in the Fabrica of St. Peter's. And that's really about bringing architecture to visibility and making it count almost wholly in the visible domain. The second is this idea of concentrating all the meaning, that through planning you could concentrate the meaning in that way. And over 500 years, we've basically come to that, which of course is the 20s fragment of the Voisin plan, where the Marais of Paris is deemed a slum and darkness, and there's this kind of fantastic highway that goes to 60-story crystalline skyscrapers sitting in a bed of lettuce with, you know, parking in them, preserving the occasional monument. But it seemed to be, you know, moving into this world of light and redemption. You know, it's this kind of weird symbol that is, you know, that testifies to the emptiness of Le Corbusier's idea of what a city. I mean, he couldn't have lived in his city. Now, what prepares the ground, of course, for Le Corbusier is my second motif of flattening, is what happens with the 19th century metropolis, the world usually associated with Benjamin and Zimmel, where you first start getting the phenomena of mass culture, both positively and negatively. Positively in the sense of, you know, the cafe culture, all the museums, the arcades and so forth, that de Carrico gets so upset about. He takes this notion of a city full of engineered goodness and undermines it and shows the kind of evil that lies directly behind this capacity to engineer goodness. It's also where we learn to connect the periphery to the center through, you know, networks like you see here, these kind of road networks, metros, sewage, lighting, plumbing, so on and so forth. What has become the favorite topic of, you know, gigantic cities, infrastructure. And you always say infrastructure for what? And we'll come to that. And a lot of that is governed by hygiene and efficiency, but also a kind of sense of decorum of what makes a proper town. And what I've done, this is all from Milan. What I showed you first was the major 19th century intervention. On the left is, you know, the largely 16th and 17th century city intervened in the 19th and 20th centuries, and below is a purely 20th century topography, mostly housing. It's on the bottom end of the Via Argentina. And you can see that the thing is, across those three slides, the open space is, you know, it's a very familiar diagram, has transformed from something that's always making settings to this weird territory, then weird attitude to nature that is kind of municipal. It's supposed to represent a species of freedom. What that leads to is my third condition of flattening, is this tendency that grows up with a metropolis of thinking of the collective less as a political order, but more as statistical trends. You know, 30% of people in Paris in 1820 have toilets, or, you know, one of these. So we got to increase the percentage. You know, who these people are, they're just the people without toilets. And it becomes particularly vicious when it comes to housing, which takes dwelling in any number of settings, ranging from a palace to an attic, and turns it into, you know, a whole regime that can be distributed as a territory, as you see in Le Corbusier's Amsterdam plan, which of course he tries to save by having a right angle that's a kind of part for the mind and a part for the body, with an administrative alley that goes from the airport, this is when there were biplanes, to the cathedral, which is basically his motor car and Parthenon replayed. So what's happened to dwelling is that it's just become this statistical generalization. There's no real difference. These were both about the same period. This is Beckentry, in East London, at the time the biggest construction site in Europe, suburbia, and that's from the inside of Le Corbusier's Ville Radieuse, the Radiant City. One's vertical, one's horizontal. This is, I'm not going to go through it, a diagram of the structure of meaning in Le Corbusier's flat between the two sides in the middle. And it's all quite elaborate and interesting, but I'm not sure that in terms of the way it relates to the overall life of the town, it's any different from this little shot from an American suburbia on the right. In other words, part of this, one of the things you see in sociology is this emphasis on the agent or the subject. And what's really unclear as to what kind of context that agent or subject dwells. It's the same figure as you get in Adam Smith's conception of economy as the selfish or self-interested individual. And to me, David Lynch is the guy who really captured how this thing works. That is to say, there's this, life begins to become introverted, focused around the individual, and what the collective is, you know, describable only by statistics or kind of the kind of planning that we saw for housing. It's just a kind of zone. And he connected in Twin Peaks. There's bits of this in Mulholland Drive and Blue Velvet, but Twin Peaks is a piece that systematically worked its way through what this kind of attempt to buy good, you know, make goodness available in the market. And of course, you only get certain strata in the market you can afford, and then project that back to you in prime time on television. And so you'll recognize the IKEA room planner, which of course you all use when you're designing your flats. Where, you know, you get IKEA furniture in the bottom, you click on it and it pops up and you push it around in the room. And I've put Bob behind the lamp from Twin Peaks because, as you all know, having seen Twin Peaks, and that's the stairs up to the bedroom underneath, that's where all the difficulty, he picks probably the only really private moment in the house and uses that as the nucleus for a whole world where the benign nature of the Pacific Northwest is turned into something, you know, full of aliens, drug dealers, houses of prostitution, Native Americans, and Bob. You know, Bob comes out from behind the couch. This stuff is really worth analyzing very closely. And I've just to give you a sense of what he did is he put the whole thing in a kind of semiotic system, just the way a market would do, and allowed other directors to play with it. And this is a little scene from, I think it's segment 3, I can't remember. That's a kind of little rebus that indicates the kind of space that he's playing with, where you get this muskox cradling the instrument of his own destruction, and the muskox is white, and the telephone and speaker next to it are black, and the telephone receptor and the rifle are made to compare to each other. I.e., he's working this field of radical analogies that actually begin to talk about the kind of, I don't know, existential milieu in which this kind of market-driven, purchasable pleasure that sort of brings the hidden evil directly along with it creates. I mean, and if in general a suburbia is a kind of, I mean, most American cities are a kind of 3D graph of how to consume the land. The next level, the fourth level of flattening the city, are a whole bunch of metaphors we all use to describe, instead of urban life, we try to make the city a figure that we can work with. At the top of this list are space and form. People still talk about, you know, built form as if that were somewhere or something, other than form with insulation and wallboard and happiness. Morphology, fragment field, system, typology, statistical or sociological distribution, rhizome, network, abstract machine. They get progressively more abstract. And as this stuff was just starting to take off, this is supposedly from the period, this is, as you know, this is Rossi, one of Rossi's students' project in the ETH from his first period there, and Rowe up above, was an attempt to sort of say, you know, there's a different kind of city, but in fact it was pitched, particularly the figure field has become everybody's standard diagram for public-private, when in fact public is many, many strata. You know, the living room is still part of public life, or the kitchen in a suburban house. And then you can work your way up to workplaces, cafes. You know, then you start getting into spaces like crowds, in which, you know, it doesn't have a political value, but it's it's outdoors. And this is good for registering what's outdoors, what's indoors. It's useless for describing what's, you know, everybody talks about public-private as if they were, you know, two different people. That there's many more shades of gray, which is where life happens. And I don't have time to go into type and monument. We can do that another day. Except to say that it radically oversimplifies what the city is, and it was part of a structuralist, the way Marxism got seduced by structuralism. And again, I'm not This was just a comment about equality as it looks in, this is the part of Shanghai that isn't Pudong. That's about 7 miles across, and I just want you to appreciate the deep texture of similarity, all facing south. I mean, the roads are more lyrical than the houses. That's a stadium, not the letter O, and that's the same thing at the scale of London, going from the Serpentine to the Tower. And I'm not going to have a chance to talk about that. I.e. that notion of equality, when you start describing it kind of statistically, what do you mean? You know, what is it that you just, the more you flatten it to something like, I mean, space is just deeply promiscuous. It got invented to cope with everything, and as a result is never anything specific. It always has to be, it's one of those terms that people started adding to politics, psychology, as if to kind of, you know, so it's doubly lost. Psychology is another one of my enemies. It only got invented in the 19th century to take the place of a soul. It's still got psyche in it, but it's got nothing to do with soul. Anyway, the fifth layer of flattening was the period when we got into seeing the city according to linguistic terminology. And that's not language, it's linguistics. It's an attempt to describe language. And this is the whole world of signs, codes, semiotic systems. And that first began to appear with the La Villette projects of Oma and of Bernard. And eventually, of course, became the world that, you know, Rem produced, that in his hands had an element of wit and tragedy to it. But in the main, it wasn't very different from, you know, turning the center of Birmingham into a mall. And the lack of clarity between what the critical edge of that was and what is the difference between brand loyalty and political commitment, if there is one. And again, that's not an easy question to answer. But what the City of Signs produces is something like the city at night, where you lose the connection with earth and with light, and it just becomes a series of commands, you know, turn left, turn right, go slow, eat here, get laid here, see a movie here, dance here, you know. And it, you know, that what's gone dark is really what the city is. And it produces, you can do this for whole cities, as you probably know from Westfield, where they basically got the world's biggest shopping mall designer to do Stratford Newtown. Absolutely grim. Or this example, which when I first pulled the slides was still in, you know, in people's dreams, and it's now half built. This is Songdo off Incheon Airport, planned by KPF, but what I'm interested in is how it was retailed. This is all stuff from Gale with a couple of images from KPF. Notice that they, in the upper right, my God, it's green. What happened? Look, these are really pretty slides. We should be in black and white. It's better than green. Is it green for you too, or is it just my angle? Holy shit.
It hasn't been green all the way through, it's just turned green recently.
Is that also, and it does that. It means I'm over. It means I've run out of time. Okay, anyway, at the upper, what a shot. At the upper right, you see they're actually trying to sell it to people. Well, actually, first look at the one on the left. It's the gateway to Northeast Asia. So there's an incredibly primitive motif, a gateway to the whole of Northeast Asia. I mean, what the fuck is that? I mean, basically, it's a response to Hong Kong, you know, and so they want to be the northern alternative to Hong Kong. And on the right, they're you know, it's like every architect's slide tray. They've in the full advertisement they've left. There's one city left off, but it's a combination of Paris, Venice, New York, and Sydney. And you know, you just put them together. You don't need the rest of Australia. You don't need France. You certainly don't need the whole history of Europe. It's just stuff that you can lay out. You know, grey, and you drive orange through it. Sorry, you can't tell that's orange, but it is. And they want the whole, it's like a live-in website. Everything, you know, it's all Wi-Fi everywhere. And they're really hooked into this. you know, this is where you start retailing the whole city as a product. And of course, the queen of this hop is Dubai, about which I'm not going to say anything because we don't have time. The last example that I want to look at is the business of trying to, it was following on from an insight that first appeared in fundamental physics, that built out of an article of 1949 by Claude Shannon, that entropy in matter had the same formula as entropy in information. So it meant it took about 50 years for it to dawn on people, right, we can get rid of matter, we can treat it all as energy and information. And out of that, that's sponsored a whole way of trying to understand these global cities as information structures, which is, and what I've done here is on your left, I'm just not going to look at that screen. On your left is a series of plots done by a Parisian attempts to model the economic history of Europe from the 15th century to the 21st, you know, centers and so forth. And in the right is obviously Zaha's project, which was done parametrically, but basically all it was control of block sizes and building types. In fact, it's very close to the Vilradieuse in its types. But the implication is if you had a powerful enough machine that you could take the economic data and feed it into your machine and it would whip up, you know, images that might look like this, i.e. that you could convert richness, depth, stuff that has to do with ethics, into complexity, i.e. it's all one horizon of representation, it's all connected together as a system. And we tend to use system much too much for what constitutes continuity. Okay, so this is my second city, what I call economics, because it's built around these generalizations and abstractions of what constitutes the collective. And it's done in parallel, to tell you what, just to save some time, well, okay, with the Aristotelian city, where nature is treated as a resource, or politics, as Hannah Arendt observed and Agamben followed, is very instrumental, i.e. it's all about managing health, labor, economics, which puts puts a priority on these kind of techno-formal concepts for managing these cities, which are understood to be providing the infrastructure for the exercise of well-being of the selfish individual, leading to this kind of rip, mix, and burn culture that is full of diversity, but very thin on what lasts, what's meaningful, what what the continuity is. And the little box on the right comes from Lefebvre's book from about 1972, The Urban Revolution, where he described the state as managing the infrastructure of well-being delivered by planners and technocrats whose main interests were efficiency, and criticized by the humanists who saw the society as damned by the operation of the first two. But he makes this interesting insight that it turns space into its own delirium, where it's minutely planned, either aesthetically or technically, and becomes therefore ultimately repressive. Again, interesting insight. This is a comment on the actual nature of economics, which I'm not going to go into. But what Agamben points this out, that in fact politics has drifted from being that for which your city, politics is a life in which the potential of being human represents itself as something dignified, rather than just operators, trying to manage the infrastructure. And it's like the culture is turned upside down in the city that moves from ethos to economics in terms of what it's for. And so, to my mind, what Rossi and Rowe posed as the standard problem of the traditional versus the modern city, the traditional city being a topic, as I say, that goes back to the early 19th century, is actually should be represented this way, as what you're looking at on the right is an attempt by the Los Alamos Institute to see how long it would take a single ice cream cone laced with botulism to poison all of Portland, Oregon. And in order to do that, they modeled all the ways people met each other. And so it goes through family, school, and then this shows the cascade of pollution, but what it also is a structure of a potential diagram, really turning the city into information. Right, we're just about out of time. All this is to say, and again, we don't have time to go into it, is that something similar has happened to our ideas of nature, which have gone from being that which is fundamental, that which is the basis for interpretation of our freedom, to being something that's managed by our concepts. And so it's become this extraordinary world between kind of quantum theory on the one hand, and he and she, or me and my lover at the beach, the other, with kind of Caspar David Friedrich in the middle. And this business of what is nature and how we understand nature is something that, is now afflicted by these familiar images, i.e. the whole process of global warming, the degree to which our lifestyle, all the bright lights in the top image are a kind of cancer. And if we get 4 degrees of warming, according to New Scientist, what it means is everything between latitude 50 south and 50 north becomes desert, and we all move into the tundra, which they claim has just enough land to support everybody, but there's a good architecture project for someone. It's like the problem of, where there's a real opportunity. What global warming has put on the agenda is how we collaborate. And it's put on all the key questions are ethical. And that's a real opportunity. I.e. there's all sorts of ways of trying to hedge the bet. The boffins in California will come up with some way by which our cars produce oxygen, so on and so forth. But in terms of the deep understanding, there's this opportunity for collaboration, and in particular for figuring out what local is in respect of these global situations. And if roughly we're positioned between Dubai and Dharavi is this kind of arm's length metabolism that, it's basically a whole aggregation of rooms in a kind of beehive. But you really see what goes, these are slightly artificial communities because they depend on the global city in order to live. They do things like recycling, as you know, and so on and so forth. But there is a kind of solidarity to living this way that is missing from, the platinum card world of Dubai. That's just Dharavi. Density, way to work with. Right, I think you're now going into a period of whizzing past slides. One way of thinking the problem is it's an attempt to recover the comic set, i.e. that's been always taken as the background, as the kind of topography of sickness that needs to be cured. And curiously, these are all from Half-Life 2. It turns up most prominently, the guys who did Half-Life 2 are one of the few people who refer to depth of city the way I do. They sent a whole team to Central Europe and came back with the dimensions and structures of the city. And the good guys live in the stuff in the foreground, and the bad guys live in REM, in the background, the aliens. But this business of how to think the comic set, how it has its integrity, both socially and politically, we're not going to, is a question that I found addressed and made vivid in the only text that really has managed to capture city, in my view, as a whole, is in a way that architects and planners simply can't, and it's not simply because of the complexity of the language, is Joyce's Ulysses. And of course, as you know, it mostly happens, it has very little to do with the stuff that's, in the tourist guides of the time. And as you know better than I do, Dublin was one of Europe's abject cities at the time. And it's all living in this kind of world of people who don't get it, or who are partially get it, or who are bigoted. I.e. it really captures what a city lives off of, rather than all these ideal middle-class consumers who are always going through doors in fair weather, under blue skies and so forth. And just to give us to give a hint at the completely opposite end of the scale, how, I mean, what the thing that he does with this city is show that it is kind of a heaven, you know, new Blue Musalem. It is still the paradigm of European city, even in this abject state, again, as you know. And yes, the richness of the language helps carry it. But it's also a phenomenon like this. This is the old Ormond, which has since been rebuilt about 3 times. And working with a student, Freddie Phillipson, we managed to recover enough documents and description to get a kind of rough idea of what its actual topography was then. And on the ground, it consisted of 4 rooms: a bar, a saloon for singing in the back, and next to that, a restaurant, which only has 1 table in it for a reason in a minute, and behind that, a kitchen. And the way Joyce works with it, first of all, it's on the Liffey, and that's a horizon to the rest of seas and, you know, cosmic sea and so on and so forth. And then there's another, the opposite direction, goes deep into the city. Up above it are the rooms. And at one point, you have a lot of singing going on in the saloon bar. That's a mixture, it's mostly Irish love and war songs. So there's kind of Ireland singing with occasional links to various operas and, you know, religious music and so forth. Whereas in the bar, it's all about, you know, chat and loud conversation. And there's kind of 2 structures with it that are built around glass. The mirror and the window go along horizontally in the bar, and there's a skylight over the saloon, which my model you can barely see, and probably in green you can't see at all. Take my word for it, there's a skylight there. And Leopold Bloom is sitting in the restaurant all by himself, and Stephen Dedalus' father stops by the thing that's in the foreground, which is in the corner of the bar, which is, you know, a domed piece of glass over a leftover bit of bread with a sardine on it, which, and Stephen Dedalus' father remarks, Bloom alone. And in that little insight, first of all, he captures the theme that's been developed through the book of fathers and sons and of the wandering Jew in the city, but also of Christ as the Jew, where this thing becomes the Anastasis, a kind of witty Anastasis rotunda, with this dome over it, and that's an image of the Eucharist. I mean, this is, you know, and it's set up with this very dumb topography. It's not all, you know, it doesn't look like Kurt Schwitters or, you know, the Merzbau or something. It's built out of the praxis, it's built out of the depth of reflection and the fundamental conditions for, you know, this kind of public life. Sorry, we don't have time for this either. I want to finally return to this business of how the praxis operates as the key to this and where architecture stands. What I'm suggesting is design, architecture, whatever you want to call it, is the column on the right, derived from the Poetics, obviously. And this old business of what mimesis of nature is. It's not the use of plants or the attempt to turn people into animals or, you know, landscape urbanism. It's, you realize that what the key of tragic drama for Aristotle is what he calls the mythos, the plot, the narrative. The key to that is the moment of choice, where, you know, the main figure is usually caught between 2 goods. It's a problem of human finitude and so forth. And what is happening is that moment of choice, which is absolutely particular and historical, is being reconciled with the fundamental conditions. And that's what that word mimesis means. That's the kind of interpretation that's involved. And that nature is not simply view or green in plan. It looks more like that. It's this is the beginning of philosophy from the early 6th century. I've translated it. It would take us too long to go through this in detail. I've made one version of a translation at the bottom. That is to say, you're dealing with the fundamental conditions of being human and what's at stake, and as being finite in a world that lasts much longer, has much deeper times, much longer times. And unlike the economic city, which is all built around a rhetoric of necessity, what the city of Ethos, or Renovatio Urbis, is built around is the city as an opportunity, as, you know, how to make a setting that's up to our deepest levels of understanding. And yes, it will always involve injustice, it will always involve dirt, it will always involve suffering, you know, in various ways. But the business of being cultured is not, you know, the German Bildung, where it's about your reading list. It's about having a wise ethical understanding. And, you know, all that reading can really help, there's no question. Can fill it out, can give it detail, can give it nuance. But it's the kind of thing that's very hard to research in a research economy, when you turn what matters most to you as a university into another economy, where you can measure it by, you know, the grants you've gotten and this kind of thing. But that's a kind of mini version of problem of city as a whole, whether or not we end up living in Siberia. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I went on.